Pathways, the podcast where we have transformative conversations in education, exploring the intersection of education and social justice. I'm your host, Brittany Carey, and today I am joined by Alyssa Blask Campbell to discuss her wonderful book she co-authored with Lauren Stauble, Tiny Humans, Big Emotions. Alyssa is the CEO of Seed and Sow, has a master's degree in early childhood education, is a leading expert in emotional development, and travels the globe speaking on the topic. Her podcast, Voices of Your Village, is a gathering place for parents, caregivers, teachers, and experts creating a modern parenting village and reaches listeners in more than 100 countries. Seed and Sow serves people across the globe through speaking, consulting, online courses, and early childhood professional development programs, sharing tools and expertise to build emotional intelligence. She has been featured on expert publications such as The Washington Post, Burlington Free Press, and Family Education. Alyssa's Show Up As You Are approach welcomes people in her village to support at all ages and stages, shame-free. She explains it's never too late or too early to start. Let's get into the interview. Welcome to Conscious Pathways. Good morning.
Good morning. I'm excited to be here with you.
So excited to have you with me. I guess it's morning on my end. I don't know. I'm in California, so I don't know if you're on my side of the country.
It's morning, but not as aggressively morning. I'm in Eastern time in Burlington, Vermont, so 11.
Okay, all right.
Still counts.
It's later morning. Yeah, still morning. I find myself saying good morning at all times in the day. It could be like 7 o'clock at night. I'm like, good morning. It's like, okay, I need to chill. So good morning. I'm so excited to have you joining me today. I've been reading through this book, Tiny Humans, Big Emotions, and I can't wait to just start talking about it and diving into it. But first, do you want to tell me a little bit about your background in early childhood education? What was your inspiration? What got you here?
Yeah. Well, it's so interesting because my parents are both in education. My dad wasn't always. My mom was a stay-at-home mom, and she ran basically like an unregulated home childcare. Just we were in a low-income community, and she wanted to stay home with us, and that was how she was able to stay home. And I grew up in a town where like there weren't childcare centers, like that's not a thing, just like very rural America. And then when my little brother went to kindergarten, she went back to college and got a degree and has been in education since. And I remember when I was in college, she said something about how I would be a really good teacher. And I was like, oh, I'm not just going to be a teacher, Mom. Right? Like that felt like, oh, that's what my mom does. Like that is not for me. But I had always been like, gosh, just like around kids, literally always. I mean, from her running her program, and I like would come home on a half day of school and there were kids in my house, right? Like it was just like always around. And I'm one of 5 kids, and I babysat and nannied and like all the things. And then after college, I didn't know what I wanted to do. And so I moved to New York City and I was a live-in nanny. And while I was doing that, a friend's aunt who I just like had built a relationship with was like, you need to teach. And I was like, I mean, maybe I'll try it out for a little bit while I figure out what I want to do. Like still wasn't set on it. And then I got a job teaching preschool in New York City and immediately fell in love, and then started my master's program and have never looked back. Like it turns out everyone in my life was right. It was what I was called to do. And I love learning how our brains and bodies work. I love learning how we learn, how our nervous system works and how we process the world, and how we're so unique in that. And I feel like that was really like what drew me into education was this idea of like, oh, I get to actually just learn about humans and how humans work. And yeah, so I was teaching, and I've taught now everything from kindergarten down to infants, and I was a director of a childcare program. And then I had the privilege of doing research in building emotional intelligence in kids. So I collaborated with my colleague, Lauren Stauble. We were both teaching together at the time. She was in preschool pre-K and I was an infant toddler. And we ended up creating the collaborative emotion processing method. We call it CEP for short. and we researched it across the US, and we have a book on it now, Tiny Humans, Big Emotions.
Wow. I love that. I love how just all of I love asking that question because you just get to learn about how people got to education, and everyone's journey is just so different. But
Yeah.
the underlying theme is all just the same, is that you started working with kids, and just the love for working with kids and the love for the education and the job and just everything about it. It drew us in so much. And
Exactly.
you just have that light bulb moment of like, oh yeah, no, this was the thing I was supposed to be doing all along.
Yeah, totally. And there are times where I'm like, I couldn't have fallen in love with like banking or
Right.
whatever. Like, right? Like maybe a little less draining, a little more cash
Yeah.
flow, but no, I just like fell in love with teaching.
Yep.
And my first teaching job, I remember I was offered $30,000 and I was teaching in New York City, living in New York City,
Hmm.
which
Oof.
like you can't really live in the city for
No.
the, but at the time I was like, I don't know, 22,
Hmm.
23 maybe, and
Hmm.
I was like, oh my gosh, I'm a thousandaire, like this is incredible, I can like live on this and teach.
Yep.
And then was like paying rent and was like, oh, how do I live on this and
Yes.
teach?
The harsh
Oh
reality settles in.
yeah, oh, I'm always gonna need another job.
Yeah, that happened to me. I was living in LA and also, went into early childhood education. And I was like, wow, I'm making like $17 an hour. That
Yeah,
is the most money I've ever made. I am rich.
totally.
And in LA, that is below the poverty line.
Right, totally, totally, it's ridiculous. I mean, we could go
Yeah,
off, I feel like, on all that on a whole other episode, but yeah,
yes.
it is a whole problem.
Yes, just surprises. But so you talked about the collaborative emotional processing that you researched. So what was the process of researching that? What kind of places were you able to go to research?
Sure. So we did what's called action research, where
Hmm.
you're literally like researching it in action, right?
Yes.
And so we partnered with Brandeis University to
Hmm.
utilize their IRB, which is like the research governing body,
Hmm.
to apply. The whole like application process
Hmm.
is a whole thing in and of itself, like months long. We were going through all that.
Hmm.
And then once we got approved for research, we were able, we had a human who really, her name is Angela Garcia, really came to us and was like, we need to research this. Lauren, she was
Hmm.
teaching with Lauren at the time, and Lauren and I had been building out the method, and Angela's like, we need to research this. And so
Hmm.
she was like a driver for us. She was on our research team, and she also speaks Spanish. And
Hmm.
so it allowed us to do the research and have resources and all that jazz in English and in Spanish. And so we got
Hmm.
to serve schools across the US, with different cultural backgrounds, etc.
Wow. Then I know that was very just impactful, not only just for, the research for this book, but also, the collaborative emotional processing, one, having that research back to it. And I'm sure it also, you probably came across some findings that you might not have been expecting to come across too.
It was so rad. Like looking at the
Mm,
data and just hearing stories and
mm,
anecdotes and how this was impacting teachers and families cross culturally was
mhm,
really, really rad. And just for me, it had me double down on like, oh yeah, we have to get this out into the world.
mhm. Yes, yes. And that reminds me of something when I was reading the book that there were a lot of things that I really enjoyed and was really impressed by, and so many things that I just like, oh, I got to write this down. I got to jot this down. But there were a lot of, that you brought in those cultural understandings into it as well, because, emotions across the board, one, they're not going to be the same for everyone. Not everyone's going to process the same way, and not everyone's going to go through the same processes. But also culturally, it's going to change depending on what language you speak at home or how emotions are viewed at home. And so, really leading with that kind of curiosity instead of that judgment really helps us to build those foundation blocks to build a more kind of social, emotional, intelligent world.
Yeah, exactly. And I think helps us check our biases because we're going to come to the table with our own
Hmm.
construct around emotions
Hmm.
and what was allowed in our childhood or in our culture and what wasn't. And that's our only lens, right? That we
Yes.
come to the table with. And when we can acknowledge, like, oh, that's our bias.
Mm-hmm.
That's a bias that's coming to the table. That's not
Yes.
the only experience that people have with emotions, and that cross-culturally we're going to see different emotions being allowed or not
Mm-hmm.
allowed, responded to differently. Some
Yes.
languages have so many different words for emotions that in English we have one
Mm-hmm.
word for, right? So
Yes.
really being able to recognize that when we're talking about emotions, you can't leave culture out of it.
Yes, absolutely. It's such an integral part. When I do my trainings, I do trainings on, cultural relevancy and same practices, and that's something I always tell is like when we go anywhere, we don't just shed our culture and just leave it behind. We bring it with us everywhere we go. We bring it into the classroom, we bring it into our workspace. Everywhere we go, our culture is going to follow us. So we're doing ourselves and we're doing our classroom a complete disservice when we don't incorporate that, when we aren't actively engaging with that, and again leading with that curiosity. It's so important and so integral. And so I love just the idea of incorporating that into that emotional, intelligence landscape, and having that be a part of it, because it is. It's a very
It's
big part of
huge.
it.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I think part of that work too is even recognizing what is cultural for us, because
Mm,
when we grow up with something, it just feels like what is. It just feels like the
mm,
truth, and it just feels like the way things are done. And when we don't take the time to build awareness, self-awareness, and dive into
mm,
our biases and our social programming, it then just feels like the only truth.
yes.
And I think the idea of like we're bringing our culture into everything that we do is so true. And I don't think folks always know, like, what is my culture? Like, what is it that I'm
Mm,
bringing to this? And how does it show up? And for me, one of those things that was huge in my family growing up was respect, but it was often like
mm,
it wasn't just respect, it also included obedience was a part of respect, right? And
mhm.
that there were certain folks that had power over me, and I
Mm,
was meant to respect them, and they were meant to have the power. And that was like the culture that I grew up in. And it doesn't, without like checking that, I think it's hard to recognize like, oh, that was your culture, Alyssa. That's not just
mm.
what is.
Yes.
Does that make sense?
It makes so much sense because again, when you're growing up, you only really have that one lens,
Yeah.
right? And so it makes sense. And we know, especially with young children, they really have a hard time even stepping out of that and seeing other people's lenses, right? And so you grow up and you really only have your perspective, you only have the things that you know. And unless we start getting curious about that, and that's again a lot of the trainings that I do as well, they start with the adult in the room. They start with the
Yeah.
person. Like, let's get in touch with who you are.
It's
Right? Because
huge.
I can't expect you to go do these really big, hard things in the classroom if you don't know who you are, if you don't know where your culture is coming from, if you don't know where your biases are coming from. And those all come from just our one perspective. But sometimes our perspective isn't like, it's your reality. It might not
Yes.
be someone else's reality.
Right. Right. And my friend Dr. Lynetta Willis calls these legacy blessings and legacy burdens,
Mm,
right? That we're bringing from our childhood. And some of them are blessings and we want to pass them on. And some of them have been burdens for us and we don't want to
mm,
pass them on. And until we have that awareness of what we're even bringing, we
mm,
can't then choose what are we going to pass on versus not.
mm.
And instead, our triggers just become our truth, right? That
Yes.
the we're triggered by manipulation, or it feels like this child's being so manipulative or
Mm,
defiant. And
mm.
that just feels true in the moment. It doesn't feel like a
Yes.
trigger, it just feels true.
Yes.
And without that awareness for ourselves, it's really hard to separate it out and say, oh, that feels true because of my childhood. I'm triggered because this is something that in my childhood would not have been allowed or explored.
Mhm.
No one sought out, like, what is the need that's driving Alyssa's
Yep.
behavior? It just on the surface was defiant or manipulative.
Mhm.
And so it makes sense to have a reaction to that as an adult. if you
Yeah.
didn't experience anyone else diving in and saying, I wonder what's going on for you here. If it was
Yep.
just that that behavior was defiant or
Mm-hmm.
manipulative, or that you were being defiant,
Mm-hmm.
manipulative, right? And there are so many other triggers, but those are two that for me come up in the
Yes.
moment because of my childhood.
Yes. Yes. And I remember thinking back, I always say, we can only do better when we know better, right? And so, I think about those first early years when I was teaching. I definitely had some of those same thoughts you were talking about of, oh, this child they're crying because they're trying to manipulate me, or, their behavior is being defiant, or they're being disobedient, they're being disrespectful. And
Mm-hmm.
exactly what you're saying. It wasn't until I started doing my own internal work of, okay, wait a minute. I know that developmentally, this child, one, probably does not have the skills to fully manipulate a fully grown adult. And two, I don't think that that's what they're doing, right?
Yeah.
Or, people call attention seeking behaviors, like, oh, like, don't give in to their attention seeking behaviors, where it's like, well, but they're communicating a need, right?
Yeah.
And so I'm doing them a disservice by ignoring that need. And it wasn't until I started working on my own kind of things, my own childhood, of like, oh yeah, when I was a child, I was supposed to like kind of just, be seen but not heard,
Correct. Not have needs.
not have needs and all of
Yeah.
that. And I could feel myself, like, just the anger bubbling up when there was just a child who I viewed as needy, or
Oh,
there was a
same.
child who,
I still feel it.
yes, I still feel it. It takes it. I have to step back, like, okay, breathe.
Yeah. Right. I have skills for it now, but that
Yes.
initial reaction is still
Mm-hmm.
very real. The skill to hone is that finding that pause between the initial reaction and then the response. But the initial reaction is still real, and those stay with us. These are parts of us, right? And
Yes.
we know now that behavior is a communication of a need, right? And we look at
Mm-hmm.
this, we break it down in the book of sensory needs or emotional needs. That sensory need being like, I'm dysregulated, or my nervous system's overstimulated, I need movement, I need food, I need sleep, and there's a
Yes.
sensory need there. And the other is emotional needs, and these are like a need for connection, attention,
Mm-hmm.
belonging, inclusivity. And those are often more triggering for us because a lot of us didn't
Yes.
grow up in a culture where we were allowed to have those needs, where those needs were valid,
Mm-hmm.
and they were actually looked at as inconvenient and needy and high
Yes.
maintenance and dramatic. And there were negative labels put on having those needs. And so we've learned that we aren't supposed to have those needs
Mm-hmm.
and that we're failing if we do. And so when kids now have those needs, it's triggering for
Mm-hmm.
us. It does feel needy and high maintenance and dramatic.
Yes.
And listen, it's not only a disservice to the kids to not meet those needs, it's a
Mm-hmm.
disservice to ourselves. And it
Yeah.
frankly will continue to make your life harder
Mm-hmm.
because they're going to keep, just not consciously, subconsciously, from a primal perspective, they're going to keep trying to meet those needs. And so if they have
Yes.
a need to feel connected or to belong or to feel included, and we're just ignoring those needs because we think if we ignore this quote negative behavior, it'll go away.
Mm-hmm.
What's going to happen is a new behavior is going to surface still trying to meet that need.
Yeah.
I recently, my 2.5-year-old was poking me in the hand with a fork at breakfast.
Mm-hmm.
And I realized, like, oh, this is a time where, like, I'm usually sitting next to him. My husband's like getting stuff ready for us to like head out the door, lunches, all that jazz, to get ready for work and childcare. And I was chatting with my husband. And Sage, my little guy, was poking me in the hand with the fork. And I was like, buddy, please stop poking me, please. And just like on repeat, I'm just like responding to this behavior.
Yep.
And then finally I was like, all right, that's not working, right? It's not stopping. And
Mm-hmm.
when I was able to instead, when I was able to instead turn and say, bud, I'm wondering if you want my attention. Are you feeling left out because I'm talking to daddy? And he was like, mm-hmm. And I was like, yeah, that makes sense. I was talking to daddy and you weren't included in that conversation. Instead of poking me in the hand with the fork, you can say, Mama, what are you talking about? Or Mama, I feel left out.
Mm-hmm.
And so he started saying, Mama, what are you talking about? And now that's like
Mm-hmm.
on repeat. We were actually just at my parents' house and my mom was like, what is it? Sage keeps saying, Grammy, what are you talking about? And I was like, well, it's better than being poked in the hand with a fork. But what he's saying is, I feel left out and I want to feel included. And
Yes.
we were able to give him a replacement behavior for it, but only because I was able to see the need beneath the behavior. And that is the part that's so challenging for us as the adults. And it's
Yes.
crucial to hone that skill so that we can then meet that need and give a replacement behavior.
Yes. 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 All of that. It reminds me of times in the classroom when, I was actively kind of doing my own internal work and healing my own inner child and all of those things
Yeah.
that go with it. And I had this one child in my classroom, and he was so sweet, but his mom traveled a lot for work. And I can always tell when mom travels for
Sure.
work because he just had a hard time
Sure.
emotionally. And I think there was one time when she traveled and it was just a little bit longer than it would normally be. It would normally be a couple of days. I think she was gone for maybe a couple of weeks at this point. And so, he was doing okay, but there's a breaking point, right?
Totally.
Emotionally. And, when we start getting, when they're going through these kind of emotional things, they kind of feel like their life is out of control. And so they're trying to take control back in whatever small way possible. And so his small way of taking control back was like, I'm not going to go to the bathroom when you want me to.
Yeah. What
you
can I
know,
control?
what can I control? And I'm going to control this one thing.
Yeah.
And, when you're in the classroom, you have a whole group of kids, and it's like, okay, well, I can't just leave you outside. So, we all got to go together. And, there was one time when we had just been struggling with this behavior, struggling with this behavior, struggling with this behavior. And it finally kind of clicked for me of, oh, okay, you're not being defiant to just get on my nerves.
Yeah, it is also getting on my nerves, but that's not your goal.
That's not your goal. Right.
Well,
Let me take a
and
step
that's
back.
the Brene Brown, her two things are true.
Yes.
And I feel like that comes in here of two things can be true. The behavior
Yes.
can be manipulative or defiant,
Mm-hmm.
and it can also not be their goal. It can just be
Right.
their body trying to figure out how to meet this need. But the
Mm-hmm.
behavior on the surface can appear that way, and we can
Yeah.
experience it that way.
Exactly. Exactly. And so when I finally realized that, I was like, okay, what could be going on right now? And I realized, you know what? His mom hasn't picked up in a couple of weeks at this point. So he's probably just really missing his mom. And so I just took his hand, I looked at him, and we regulated, and we got to a point of, it seems like you're really missing your mom right now. And he just breaks down, and he's just like, yeah, I miss my mom. And I then could offer a different behavior once we were regulated and we were just in a different state of
Yeah.
mind of, when you have these really big feelings, like, that's okay. If you need a hug, you can just ask for a hug. And after that moment, we'd be on the playground, he'd just come up to me, he's like, I need a hug, and I'd give him a big huge squeeze, and then he would go back and play with his friends. But that's just what he needed in that moment. And
Sure.
again, we regulated, and we got to a point of like, okay, well, if that's what you need, I would love to meet that need. Here's what you can ask for, and that need could be met all day long. We had lots of hugs
Totally.
all day.
Well, and what's key there is we have to have the self-awareness to even know what's my need. And I think this is something that us as adults often lack too, of
Yeah.
we are asserting control with something when, say,
Mm-hmm.
I was just having this conversation with one of our C team members where she was getting ready to go on a trip, and she was like, everything feels overwhelming, right? I'm trying to pack for she has kids, and trying to pack for the family and trying to get all these things done, trying to wrap up things from work and blah, blah, blah. And she's like, and then I found myself just cleaning my bathroom. And it was that's not even on the list, right? And I feel
Yeah.
like I'm so strapped for time, but I'm cleaning my bathroom. What am I doing? And I was
Yeah.
like, oh, that makes sense to me, because when everything else feels out of control, you're looking for something you can control, something you
Mm-hmm.
can check off that list, even if it's actually adding to your list and it's taking time away
Yeah.
from what could be helpful. But the awareness first of I'm overwhelmed with all of this right
Mm-hmm.
now. My body feels overwhelmed. I feel like I'm not organized enough to leave. I feel like I don't have enough support to get out of the house. The awareness of what's
Mm-hmm.
happening, of what those needs are, is really hard. So for that child, it's not that there's this manipulative behavior that he's consciously I have this need and I know what it is, and I'm still going to
Mm-hmm.
choose this other behavior. it's that they don't know what the need is, right? And so until we can say, I'm wondering if you're missing your mom.
Yeah.
Sometimes when you feel this inside, when your chest feels tight, and you feel like you might want to
Mm.
cry, or maybe we see it come out in fight mode where like you
Yeah.
feel really angry and frustrated and your shoulders go up to your ears and you don't want to play with anybody and you want to say no to
Mhm.
everything. Sometimes that means inside we're feeling sad and disappointed
Mhm.
and you might be missing your mom, but helping him connect, that's the what we call interoception, which is
Mhm.
one of the sensory systems of like, what does it feel like inside when you're
Yes.
experiencing these feelings? Because we often want kids to regulate. We want them to calm their nervous system and then access self control where they can say, I need a hug, right? To be able to
Mhm.
access that language and access that tone and behavior, etc., requires that awareness first of what does it feel
Mhm.
like inside? And then where do I
Yes.
go with that?
Yes. That is such an important aspect of it. And I know even as adults, we sometimes struggle with that. I know I still struggle.
Same.
I won't even notice for the longest time that I'm like clenching my jaw. Like
Yeah.
the tension is there and I'm like, ooh, wait, I feel that. What's going on? Let's take a pause.
Yeah.
I'm feeling tense. Why am I feeling so tense? And it just takes a lot of time and practice and work, even as adults, to get through this. So, of course, it takes time for children to also practice this and to learn these things. And it could feel really awkward at first to kind of verbalize, like, oh, I feel it in my shoulders and I feel it in this. And
Hmm.
it can feel really awkward at
Yeah.
first, but it is such a good practice to start getting more in tune, like you said, that introspection of getting more in tune of what it actually feels like, right? And then starting to ask some of those questions and being curious. And one thing I also really loved as I was reading through the book is there's a lot of non-judgment, right? We're not
Yeah.
trying to judge the feeling, right? Emotions are just, it's a part of life. There's nothing good or bad about emoting.
That's right.
It is a part of being a human being, and that's the beauty of being a human being is that we get to experience a very wide range of emotions. So being able to look at that in a way of non-judgment of, okay, I'm feeling this physically or I'm feeling this way, like, okay, what do I need in this moment? How can I regulate in this moment? And then kind of moving forward. But that introspection is such an important aspect of it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think too, there in the like, when we are looking at the non judgment, not just the feelings part of like, all
Mhm.
feelings are welcome. That makes me think of Mr. Rogers, like, all feelings are welcome and
Yes.
manageable. Which obviously, yes, I love, and that message is all throughout the book, but
Mhm.
also the non judgment when it comes to our initial reaction. That, like,
Yeah.
there have been times where a 2-year-old has slapped me across the face, and in that moment, I want to fight a 2-year-old, right?
Yep.
And like,
Been there.
that sounds nuts to say out loud, but in reality, like my nervous system is designed to want to fight somebody that hits me.
Mhm.
And it's again that initial reaction, finding that pause after that
Mhm.
initial reaction is, I think, our greatest work as adults so that we
Mm.
can respond with intention.
Yes.
But allowing ourselves to experience the initial reaction without shame or judgment. That when
Mm.
something happens, I'm like, oh, I'm annoyed with this child right now, or this behavior,
Mhm.
or whatever like narrative we assign to it, that we're allowing that to be true. That I've
Yeah.
never left a day as a parent or a teacher and I was like, wow, they did nothing that felt annoying or nothing that felt
Yeah.
inconvenient, right? Like, we don't usually build in time. They're not like, hey, excuse me, do you have a spare 10 minutes for me to have a hard time right now? Like, can you fit that into your calendar? That's not how those things work, right? And so
Yeah.
they just pop up and it feels inconvenient and it can feel
Mhm.
annoying and frustrating when it's like, I'm trying to get dinner ready or I'm trying to get all these kids ready for lunch or get out the door and to go to the playground, or we're trying to do diapers, whatever it is. And you're like, this feels inconvenient and annoying to have to deal with.
Mhm.
And allowing that to be true and that experience for ourselves to be true without shame or judgment. What you do next is what matters. How you respond is what matters. But that initial
Mm.
reaction, those narratives, what's popping up for
Yes.
you, it makes sense.
It does. It does. It makes so much sense because our fight or flight is also being activated, and we're experiencing it. Like you said, no one wants to be hit in the face, right? It's a
Right.
part of, when you're working with young people and they have big emotions and they're going to react in a way that makes sense to them to react, right? And as adults, we have hopefully gained up a lot more kind of resilience and resistance to not be able to react in that way when we experience big emotions. But these young people have only really been on the planet for like 2 or 3 years at this point.
Right.
And so really taking that, and that's another thing that was in this book, is these developmentally appropriate practices that we know very well in early childhood, is just looking at making sure that our curriculum or our expectations are developmentally appropriate for the child that we have in our room right now, right? And so taking that approach to it and looking at our expectations, am I expecting this 3-year-old to have a complete control over their emotions? Is that a reasonable expectation that I have on them?
They
And
don't have a
it's
fully developed prefrontal cortex until they're in their mid-20s.
mid
So best
20s,
of luck if
right?
that's your if that's your goal. I don't care if you're a high school teacher and
Yeah.
if you're anywhere on this spectrum,
Hmm.
here's the thing, like we can have all the skills in the world. We can have a
Hmm.
whole toolbox of
Yep.
skills. And no one on the planet has access to those skills all the time. That we are
Accurate.
meant to cycle in and out of regulation and dysregulation. That also, when we're expecting people, this is part of the like perfectionism and the culture
Mm.
of like independence, and you're not supposed to ask for help and whatever,
Yep.
all feeds from this place of once you have a skill, you need to always have access to that, right?
Yep.
Like right now, I'm 7 billion weeks pregnant. I've got 2.5-year-old. I'm on a book tour. I'm running a business.
Mm.
And almost every night, I ask my husband to please carry me to bed and brush my teeth because I'm like, I'm so spent and tired. Do I know
Yeah.
how to do those things? Totally. Do I
Yep.
always have the capacity for it? No.
No.
And so for our kids, if what we're expecting is self-control all the time, man, I hope
Hmm.
we're not expecting it from ourselves or anyone else
Yeah.
around us. We are all going to be in times throughout the day where we don't have access to self-control. When I've
Hmm.
had a long day and my husband comes home from work and I'm like sarcastic and snippy and rude, it's not because I'm
Hmm.
like, this is going to be the best way to communicate, right? This is going to
Yeah.
be most productive. No, it's because I'm dysregulated
Yeah.
and I'm not accessing self-control in those moments. And
Yeah.
that's okay. We get to have like rupture and repair. We get to be disconnected and reconnected. But I think so often we hold kids to this standard of like, oh, I know that you have this skill and now you need to be able to elicit that skill at any
Hmm.
given moment.
Yes. Yes.
It's
And
bonkers.
it's bonkers, yes. When you really think about it, you're like, well, wait a minute, because I don't have the capacity to do all those things at all times. Like, I
No.
get dysregulated, and even when I'm dysregulated, and I know that I have a whole toolbox of things that I can do when I get dysregulated, but sometimes you're just at that level of dysregulation where the tools aren't tooling.
No, exactly. Exactly.
I
Yeah,
just I need to just exist in space for a minute.
right.
Just hold on.
It's real.
It's real. It's very, very real. And I love that the aspect of like that sensory needs are really important and really prominent in this book as well, because one, there's a lot of real life examples, lots of things that any person who works with children or any person who has children in their lives
Has
has
seen a
either
child. Yeah.
seen a child, like
Totally.
you've been through, experienced, or heard of the classic. You have a child who is just having a full blown breakdown in the grocery store.
Mm-hmm.
And when you take back your own kind of perspective and lens and kind of broaden that, the grocery store could be a really overwhelming experience. There's
Totally.
a lot of things around you that you're not supposed to touch, but you really want to touch.
For sure.
And there's a lot of really long, narrow aisles that would look really fun to run down, right?
And just overstimulating for a lot of
It's
kids. The visual
overstimulating.
stimulation, it can be
Yeah.
loud in there. Like
Mm-hmm.
there's a part of them that's wondering, what are the rules? What are the expectations? What are
Yes.
the boundaries? And I've
Mm-hmm.
never set a boundary for a kid and they were like, great, I can't wait to follow it. Thanks for keeping
Yeah.
me safe. Right? Like it
Mm-hmm.
is their job to say, like, okay, when we were coming into this grocery store, mom said that we were not going to buy anything extra off of our list. Here's what we were
Mm-hmm.
going to get. And now I'm wondering if that's still true once we're in there. Is
Yes.
it still true if I am having a hard time? Is it still true
Yeah.
if I am feeling mad? Like, they're not
Mm-hmm.
consciously asking these questions, but subconsciously,
Yeah.
their
They
body's
feel it.
saying, is this still true? We see
Yeah.
it all the time of like with your little guy whose mom was traveling for work, that he's probably in that time pushing boundaries he doesn't usually push to say,
Mm-hmm.
is this still true when mom's away? Or at home,
Yeah.
we might see like, oh, grandparents are visiting. Is this still the rule that I can't jump
Mm-hmm.
off the couch onto the coffee table when grandparents are here? Like, what are
Yeah.
the rules at
Yeah.
any given time? And it's their job to ask that. And when we have that expectation that it's their
Mm-hmm.
job to ask that, it becomes easier for us to respond with intention because we're not caught off guard all the time.
Exactly. Exactly. So just our ability to, again, be in tune and be aware really impacts our ability to just be intentional in the way that we respond, and also being intentional about how we feel the emotions and the things bubbling up, right? Because when you're at the grocery store and your kid's having a hard time and you feel like everyone's staring at you and you feel like everyone's judging you or everyone thinks, oh, I must be a bad parent or blah, blah, blah. When in actual reality, no one's really paying that much attention.
No, anyone that's looking at you is like, gosh, I've been there and I know how hard it is.
Yeah. Every time I've seen it, I'm like, I feel you.
Yeah.
Kids having a hard time, I feel for you. And so being able to then regulate ourselves in those moments just enough to that we can regulate that situation.
Yeah.
And it's such a hard skill to do because in that moment you just want to be like, just stop, like, just pay
Please
attention or
stop
just,
making my life inconvenient.
yeah, like, and then acknowledging that, like, you might be feeling embarrassed, you might be feeling angry, you might be now feeling dysregulated, right?
Yeah.
And those are all natural and okay ways to feel about the situation that is very stressful and a little embarrassing and hard.
Especially if you grew up in a culture where public tantrums were not
Mm,
allowed, where you were not allowed to have hard feelings outside of
nope,
the
nope,
home.
nope.
And if that's the case, then when your kid has a hard feeling outside the home, it's going to be triggering.
Yeah.
And it doesn't mean you're failing, that
Mm-mm.
but it will be triggering. And so as you notice those triggers and you can build that awareness, it allows you to find that pause so that you can regulate and respond with intention. We got to dive
Sure.
so much into how to do that and what it looks like in practice in the book.
Yes, which I really love. I love that there are real life examples either in the classroom or outside of the classroom, whether it's in your home or all of that. I love that there's real life examples. It has a lot of really deep information in the book, but it doesn't read like a textbook,
Yeah, great.
which is
Great.
important. Yes. I know I was a weird teenager and I would read textbooks for fun, but most
Yeah, I
people
love it.
don't do that.
Well, I learned best through stories, right? So, like,
Yeah.
for me, it made sense for us to write it that way. Of
Hmm.
like, we're telling stories to be able to elicit these different reactions,
Hmm.
responses, behaviors, to be able to have a depiction of what does this look like in practice. And for me, I definitely wasn't a kid who grew up reading textbooks. In fact, I like spark notes my whole way through life. And so I am the opposite in that, like,
Hmm.
if we would have written a textbook and you handed it to me, I would have been like, great, I'm going to set this on the shelf and never read it.
Yep.
I needed something that felt accessible. That's how I
Hmm.
learn, is through stories and accessible information. My
Sure.
queen for this is Brene Brown. I think she does such a beautiful
Hmm.
job of taking data and nerdiness and academia and
Yes.
breaking it down into tangible, actionable stories and ways to like understand and comprehend the
Mm.
information. And she's always, for a long time, been my queen here.
Yes. Yes.
And uh so we really like tried to channel like what does it look like to do that, to take academia and data, because we researched the set method. It is actually the first manuscript we wrote ever was really like kind of like a textbook. It was
Mm.
really nerdy, and our agent was like, this is great,
Hmm.
and it needs to be
Yeah.
more accessible.
Yes,
And
and.
so we so we wrote the proposal with her and de-nerdified a lot of it.
Mm.
And then we got the deal with HarperCollins, and the editor was like, this is great. We love it. We needed a little more accessible. And I was like, oh man,
Yeah.
this is already the more accessible version. But it was so good for us and for me, I think, because it helped make this book available then for more humans, right?
Mhm.
Accessible for more humans, to be able to consume and understand and ultimately put it into practice.
Yes, yes. And I felt that throughout the book. I definitely felt that it felt really relatable. There were moments where I'm like, yeah, I've been there.
Yeah.
Or it's just like, yeah, like I know I've had that happen in the classroom, or all these different things in these different stories, and I knew that I could relate to it, which just, you know, made the information kind of sink in that much more
Hmm.
and that much better. It was just really great. And another aspect is I think it really humanized children. I think
Mm.
sometimes we forget to humanize children in the moment. There's a lot of really big emotions, and there's a lot of go 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 go, and there's a lot of there's schedules, and there's you got to go to daycare or preschool and school and all these different things. We're constantly moving when there's children involved, that we forget to humanize their experience. Again, they haven't
Yeah.
really been on this planet for very long.
Yeah, we hold them to different standards than we hold
We
ourselves a lot
do.
of the time.
We
Uh,
do.
and just expect, I think of myself even like we joke that if it's not on my calendar, it does not exist. I will not show up for it.
Yep.
And it's how I keep track of information, right? Like calendars, I
Mm-hmm.
use a clock to know like what
Yeah.
time is it now? When's my next thing happening?
Mm-hmm.
Alarm clocks, to-do lists. We have a
Mm-hmm.
meal plan on our fridge where my husband and I know like what groceries do we
Yep.
need to get? What's for dinner tonight? We use all these things to help us move through the day. And so often with kids, we're like, just remember it, follow along and
Yep.
remember it.
Yep.
And it isn't fair. They can't read the
No.
clock when they're really young. And so what tools are we giving them? And I know as a parent and as a teacher, there've been so many times where I've said, okay, guys, we're going to clean up in 5 minutes or
Mm-hmm.
whatever. We're going to head out the door in 2 minutes. And sometimes 5 minutes is legit 5 minutes. Sometimes it's 1 minute. Sometimes it's
Yep.
20, right? Like sometimes they get caught up in a task. And now I'm like, oh, shoot. I had said 5 minutes and whatever. The kid doesn't know. And like the thing is, when we can give them these tools that we use ourselves and we
Mm-hmm.
can give them calendars and we can give them
Yes.
visual timers and things like
Yes.
that to communicate what's happening in the world around them, it helps
Mm-hmm.
their nervous system regulate. It helps them
It
know what to
does.
expect. And it's a gift we give ourselves that we don't often give kids.
Oh, 100%. I think I had, with every classroom, there's a different behavior that just seems to arise, and it's just a collective behavior. And you're like, okay, this is the behavior in this classroom. Cool,
Yeah.
let's work with this. And with all 2-year-old classrooms, transitions are just very difficult. Transitions
Mm-hmm.
they're hard for any child, but 2-year-olds, they really struggle with this concept of transitioning from activities and transitioning
Yeah.
from classroom to out, all the different things. And so I think having a visual one, we had a visual calendar of kind of like this is what our day looks like, and two, we had a visual timer, so it had little
Yeah.
colors on it. So green means go, and then it would turn 11 when it was like, or it would turn yellow when it was like, oh, you have one more minute, and then red
Yeah.
was like, okay, it's time, like it's all done. And that really did help with the transitions. It helped with the regulation, and also it helped with that social interaction, because the kids would be looking at the timer. I'm like, no, it's green, just go play, you don't have to stare at the timer. This is not the game. But they
Totally.
would be staring at it like, okay, it's going to turn yellow, and then we're all going to clean up. They're all trying to hold each other accountable, like, do you see it's yellow?
Well, and they want to know when it's coming, right? Like my 2-year-old
Yes.
will still do this. I'll say, all right, buddy, I can set a timer. And then he's like, can
Mm-hmm.
I hold it? And we have like one on our
Yep.
fridge, but if we're out and about, I'll just use it on my phone and he can see it counting down.
Mm-hmm.
And then he'll spend that next like 30 seconds just looking at the thing. I'm like, what? Is this how you want to spend your time? Fine.
Right.
But for him, it's like, okay, I need to know when it's coming. And
Yeah.
this is how I know when something's coming next in the same way that we
Yes.
use a clock.
Yes, yes. And
Yeah.
I know that I had a very chaotic childhood. There was lots of change, lots of things that was happening. And so I even know as an adult, I do better when I know what to expect. When I
Yeah,
know
we
what my
all do.
schedule looks like. When I know and I have
Yeah.
concrete ideas, I'm cool. I'm calm, cool, collected. I'm a cool cucumber.
I wouldn't say I'm cool as a cucumber in those instances, but I'm cooler.
I'm cooler. When I don't know, then I'm just like, okay, I'm an angry cucumber. Like, what is happening, right?
Well, and that's literally primal. Like our nervous
Mm-hmm.
system, when it doesn't know what to expect, it always has to be on alert. It
Yes.
has to be looking out to say, like, what's happening next? Who's coming next?
Mm-hmm.
Who's picking me up? When are we leaving? What should I know about this? Am I safe here? Is really what it's always asking. Am I safe here?
Mm.
And when you have expectations that are known, when you know what's coming next, when you have really clear boundaries, you know what to
Yes.
expect from the humans around you, when there's consistency in your
Mm-hmm.
routine. Every time we work with childcare programs and they start off like, oh, we have these behaviors, etc. I'm like, tell me about your routines. And if they don't have consistency in their routines, that is where we're starting. That
Mm-hmm.
if you don't have consistency in your routines, then you got kids who are constantly asking, am I safe? What's
Mm-hmm.
coming next? And as a baseline, they're going to be dysregulated.
Yeah. Yeah. And it makes sense, right? Like it makes so much sense. But when we aren't actively humanizing children,
Yeah,
it can be so easy for us to overlook it. Of, oh, I said 5 minutes and now the 5 minutes are done. Like, go put it away. We're done. No more of that. And that can be so hard. Even as an adult, it would be really hard for someone to just, like, if I'm using my coloring book and I'm living my best life, and then someone's just like, okay, like, you're done, put it away. We're going to our next task now. And it's like,
correct.
oh, hold on. I wasn't done. Uh,
Yeah,
but this idea of humanizing children and really coming into their humanity and just recognizing that, yeah, their emotions are valid, even if we don't fully understand them. They are
totally.
still valid, right? The breakdown over getting the blue cup instead of the red cup, while
Mm-hmm.
it may not matter to me what cup you use, to them, they have so little autonomy in what they get to choose and do. And you not giving them this choice, that was the straw. Like, that was
And
the thing.
frankly, every morning I get to pick my coffee cup.
Yeah,
And I have
yeah,
favorites. I don't want
yeah,
Zach's. I don't want my husband's coffee cup. I want my coffee cup.
yeah.
And I have favorites. I like how it feels in my hand. I like the design of
Mm-hmm.
it. Like, I have favorites, and that's okay. I think that
Yeah.
really comes down to that like power over culture that so many of us grew up
Mm-hmm.
in, where this just came up yesterday with my 2-year-old. I had said, like, all right, buddy, in a couple of minutes, we're going to clean these up and we're going to go downstairs. He was playing with my
Mm-hmm.
necklaces. And he was, the timer beeped. He loves the timer. His timer
Yep.
beeped. And I was like, all right, it's time to head downstairs. And he goes, but mama, I wasn't finished. I'm trying to hook this one and then I want to go. And I could at that moment decide, like, no, we just have to do this arbitrarily on my timeline where we have to leave
Mm-hmm.
right now. Or I can slow down and say, sure, bud, we can be in a collaborative relationship here, right?
Yes.
Where, like, yeah, why don't you finish hooking that one and then we can go downstairs? And he said, thanks, mama. And like, that
Yeah.
was it. But we have this relationship built of like, I don't need to have power and control over you simply to
Mm-hmm.
have power and control over you. I will set and hold boundaries when they need to be held, especially around safety and health, and to let you
Mm-hmm.
know that like you don't have to call the shots as a kid, that that's my job and
Yeah.
I'll take care of that and I'll keep you safe. And also, there are some times where we're going to set boundaries and they're pretty arbitrary and we can slow down and just be in relationship with these kids.
Yes. Yes. And it often doesn't take that much extra time, and you build
No.
that connection and that relationship, which is so integral and so important in those moments. And it's
Yeah.
just beautiful. So, thinking about these really amazing topics that we all just talked about, how do you reimagine the landscape of education?
I hope to see more of a focus and understanding and prep and support, I guess, for teachers to
Mm.
know what's happening in the nervous system, to understand the
Yes.
8 sensory systems and recognize there's no one size fits all, that
Mm-hmm.
how our brains and bodies filter information in the world is unique to all of us. And that also means that then what my nervous system craves for regulation might be something that the next person is sensitive to and drains their nervous system.
Mm-hmm.
That maybe, like, for instance, for myself, I love touch. I love a hug. I love having a hand on me. Like, I could have a massage for 4 days and I'm like, I want more. My child is drained by touch. It's one of his sensitivities. And so if I give him what I need in a hard moment when he's having a hard time, it actually further dysregulates him. And so when we stop seeing education as this one size fits all and start to incorporate the nervous system into it, I think it'll be a game changer for all learning because it'll start from a place of self-awareness and regulation which then allows us to access self-control for our words, our behavior, our language, our ability to take in whatever content is being provided.
I agree, and I love that. I know when I started learning more about, the importance of sensory play and sensory needs and your nervous system, the more I started just to understand my students, and also the more I started to just understand myself and understand what kind of experiences make me feel the most overwhelmed or the most dysregulated, and how can I support myself in those things. That has helped me to really even just center my life. I know that I get really stressed out when I go to the grocery store. So you know what? I just order the groceries. And that is one less thing that dysregulates me in my entire day. And so I just do that. And so
for somebody else, that might be calming. Right? Like going to the grocery store can be calming. And that's what I mean here is that like the ability to differentiate and say like, also what's in your sensory bin is not going to work for everybody. And that's okay. It doesn't always have to, but recognizing that a sensory bin of tactile stuff is not enough when we're talking about the sensory systems. We have 8 sensory systems. We dive into them in the book, and really understanding those are going to help folks understand how kids are processing the entire day, the classroom, all of it. And then it lets you know like what coping strategies will work for this kid versus that kid, etc. And allowing ourselves to be in the space of curiosity as we get to know kids rather than trying to do a one-size-fits-all approach.
Yes. I couldn't agree with that more. That is something I'm constantly advocating for. I call it kind of the McDonaldization in education. You can go to McDonald's anywhere, here, Texas, the Wyoming, and you could pretty much be assured you're going to get the same thing because they have the formula down pat. You do this, you get this.
Yeah, it's delicious.
Right? But in education, we're not burgers.
We're not.
We're all different. And so what's going to work, you can't just do the same exact formula because it's not going to work for every single person. And so sometimes we just have to pay attention to, okay, what are your needs and how can I best make sure that your needs are being met so that you can have an experience in this classroom that is conducive to your learning.
Yeah, right? It's part of equity.
It's part of equity, and it's hard and it's a little tricky, but at the same time, I always think of it like as educators, we just get to be little detectives. And we just get to figure out, it's kind of like just figure out a puzzle.
Yeah.
And that's fun. That's you enter it with curiosity and you just ask questions, and it can be really fun if you allow it to be fun.
Agreed. Well, thank you. Thank you for doing this important work and spreading these messages. I think it's so key, and I'm excited to have been able to be in conversation with you. If folks are interested, the book is Tiny Humans, Big Emotions, available wherever books are sold. And we also have a pretty active Instagram at seed.and.sew, SEW. I like to hang out over there if people want to connect any further. And we have a professional development program for early childhood educators. So it is a series of workshops, but it also includes ongoing virtual coaching support for free, all available via an app, so that you don't just take a workshop and you go back into the classroom and you're like, wait, now I have questions. You can reach out at any point, and we have experts in the field of early ed, psychologists, occupational therapists, speech pathologists, etc., there to support early childhood educators in implementing this work, not just learning about it in a workshop.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And I'll link all of that in our show notes as well. So if people are curious where to find you or the book or just learn more about what you do, it'll all be linked there. And thank you so much, Alyssa, for joining me today. This was such a great conversation, and I just can't wait to share it out there with the world.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It was my pleasure.
Of course. Thank you for listening to the Conscious Pathways podcast. Don't forget to like, share, and follow Conscious Pathways so you never miss a new episode. Please leave a review over on Apple Podcasts. It really does help our show to grow and reach more people. You can also follow Conscious Pathways on YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram. And I'll be back next week for more transformative conversations in education. Thank you for listening. Bye!